Chapter 1. The Expensive Clumsiness and the Duke's Gaze. The ballroom's walls were lined with towering gilded mirrors that reflected the glittering candles and the colorful dresses of the guests, creating the illusion of an endless, sparkling labyrinth. Massive arrangements of white lilies and winter roses stood in polished marble urns, their heavy fragrance blending with the scent of beeswax and expensive French perfumes. In the background, the older lords and ladies gathered on velvet settees, whispering about the Duke's military exploits at Waterloo, and how he had single-handedly stabilized the crown's finances after the war. Many mothers looked at him with longing, hoping their daughters could melt his frozen heart, while young lords envied his unmatched influence over the Parliament. The exceptionally harsh and unforgiving winter of the year 1815 had descended upon the sprawling metropolis of London, casting a dark, bleak, and bone-chilling atmosphere that seemed to seep into the very marrow of anyone who dared to venture outdoors. Wild, tempestuous snowstorms roared incessantly and without mercy over the gray-tiled roofs of the historic British capital, carrying with them biting blizzards that completely and utterly blanketed the cobblestone streets and the grand thoroughfares in a thick shroud of white. The freezing north wind blew fiercely across the desolate hills of the outer suburbs, rattling the large glass panes of Stirling Manor, the massive imposing stone estate that stood as a monument to the power of Adrian Vance, the Duke of Stirling. Elegant and luxurious carriages, each proudly bearing the intricate coat of arms of prestigious noble families, rolled smoothly and rhythmically through the thick, swirling winter fog, bringing the absolute cream of London high society to attend the grandest ball of the current London season. Along the muddy, stone-paved roads leading to the manor, weary coachmen wrapped in thick, heavy wool coats struggled to guide their horses through half-frozen mud puddles, while inside the carriages, ladies wrapped their expensive fur cloaks tighter around their shoulders in a desperate bid to ward off the biting cold. Inside the grand ballroom of the manor, a completely different and utterly dazzling world was unfolding. The brilliant, blinding light from massive crystal chandeliers hanging from the high, ornate ceiling illuminated the shimmering satin evening gowns and the gold and silver embroidered coats of the lords and ladies who paraded across the room. The soft, elegant melodies of the royal orchestra drifted gracefully through the warm air, creating an atmosphere of immense luxury, grandeur, and sophisticated charm. However, beneath this glittering and magnificent facade lay hushed, anxious whispers about the shocking counterfeit money scandal that was currently threatening to bring about the collapse of the Treasury and the Royal Mint itself. Rumor had it that millions of counterfeit sovereign coins were flooding the market, undermining the value of the British pound, sending shockwaves of deep concern through the entire assembly of high society. Noble cliques gathered in the corners of the room, sipping warm wine while discussing the impending financial crisis with tense, worried faces. Adrian Vance stood solitary and aloof in a quiet corner of the grand ballroom, his tall, imposing figure radiating an invisible but palpable authority that kept those around him at a distance. His face looked as though it were carved from solid granite, stern and cold, without a single trace of emotion. He wore a navy blue evening coat embroidered with gold thread around the collar, the emblem of the supreme power of the Chancellor of the Exchequer. His sharp, hawk-like gray eyes swept continuously across the crowd, observing the slightest gestures of the Royal Mint officials under his command. The intimidating silence and invisible majesty radiating from him caused people to stop laughing. Wine glasses remained in hand, but no one raised them to their lips whenever His Grace crossed the threshold. It was whispered that he was a ruthless former officer who had fought at Waterloo, a man whose eyes could see through any lie. Adrian lightly raised a silver goblet containing rich red wine, preparing to lift it to his lips to acknowledge a baron who had bowed respectfully from a distance. He had no idea that a deadly trap had been set on the rim of that very silver goblet. In another corner of the ballroom, Adeline Vane worked quietly under the name Adele, a poor, supposedly deaf-mute maid. She wore a worn gray servant's dress, her long brown hair tucked neatly beneath a small white cap that partially obscured her delicate features. For the past 3 months, since the sudden and mysterious death of her father, Professor Alistair Vane, the chief assayer of the Royal Mint, in a laboratory fire, Adeline had been on the run. Her greedy cousin, Lord Stirling Vane, had conspired with dark forces to seize their estate, and was hunting her down to force her to hand over the Vane assay formula, her father's exclusive metallurgy logbook. Adeline knew that the only way to survive in this treacherous city of London was to play the part of a deaf-mute, sinking deep into the mud of the lowest servants so that no one would pay her any mind. She endured injustice with resilience but never begged, her intelligent hazel eyes reflecting the candlelight, harboring a steadfast determination that she would one day clear her father's name and reclaim everything that belonged to her. She lightly touched the small locked wooden box left by her late mother, the only relic her mother had entrusted to her, swearing to protect it at all costs. As Adeline passed near Adrian Vance to clear away empty glasses, she suddenly caught a highly distinct scent wafting from the silver goblet in the Duke's hand. It was a very faint scent of sulfur mixed with warm nitric acid, a scent her father had taught her to recognize since childhood during metallurgical experiments in their family laboratory. That was not the scent of ordinary wine. Someone had applied a thin layer of corrosive mercury salt acid onto the rim of the silver goblet, a lethal poison that would destroy the victim's internal organs within hours of a single sip. Adeline felt her heart hammering against her ribs, her fingers tightening on her silver tray. She knew that if Adrian Vance drank that wine and died, her father's honor would remain forever tarnished, and the counterfeit ring of Lord Stirling Vane would never be exposed. She had to act immediately to stop this brutal plot. Without time to hesitate or call for help, Adeline intentionally tripped on the slippery marble floor. She lunged forward, her silver tray colliding directly with Adrian Vance's arm. The silver goblet crashed onto the marble floor with a wetting clang, shattering the soft music of the orchestra. Red wine splashed across the Duke's polished black leather boots and the hem of his luxurious coat. The entire ballroom fell into a stunned silence. Every startled and searching eye turned toward them. A wave of shocked whispers quickly rippled through the large hall. "You clumsy deaf-mute servant. What on earth do you think you are doing?" Lady Cecilia Cavendish, who had been trying to stand close to Adrian to catch his attention, shrieked in fury. She stepped forward, using her feather fan to strike Adeline's shoulder roughly. "How is a low-born deaf-mute like you even allowed to serve at such a grand gathering? You have ruined the Duke of Stirling's precious coat. Where is the butler? Cast her out of the estate this instant." Adeline immediately fell to her knees on the cold floor, bowing her head low so that her brown hair covered her calm eyes. She did not cry, nor did she make excuses. She picked up the shards with trembling hands, making soft, unintelligible sounds and pointing to her ears to indicate she could not hear, playing the role of a pathetic deaf-mute maid, perfectly before the sneering crowd of nobles. She endured quietly without letting a single sob or sign of weakness escape. Indeed, she should be thrown into the dungeons for attempting to harm a peer. A royal mint official nearby added loudly. Sneers and whispers of disdain echoed through the room. They despised a poor servant whose clumsiness had disrupted the high society gathering. However, Adrian Vance did not show any anger. He looked down at the silver goblet rolling on the floor. With the sharp eye of a man who had survived battle and managed the national treasury, he noticed a very faint, bubbling gray-blue residue on the rim where the wine had spilled, a chemical reaction characteristic of acid corroding silver plating. Looking down at the maid kneeling on the floor, he saw that although her hands were stained with cleaning oil, her movements in gathering the shards showed a remarkable restraint, entirely unlike the panic of an ordinary servant. Her eyes, though carefully avoiding his gaze, flashed with an intelligent, aristocratic pride. This girl was not clumsy, she had saved him on purpose. Adrian stood tall, his imposing stature casting a shadow over the floor. His silence spread quickly, and Lady Cecilia's insults died instantly. No one dared to breathe heavily under the ice-cold gaze of the powerful Duke of Stirling. "Higgins," Adrian called in a low, cold tone, addressing the head butler. "Clear this away. Bring this girl to my library. From tomorrow she shall work there under my direct supervision." The entire ballroom murmured in astonishment. Lady Cecilia gaped, intending to object, but Adrian's razor-sharp look silenced her, forcing her to retreat. Adeline bowed her head respectfully, her heart sighing in relief but also filled with apprehension. The cold Duke had noticed something about her. In the kitchens below, a small army of cooks and scullery maids worked frantically, preparing roasted meats and rich puddings for the guests above. The cold stone corridors of the estate echoed with their hurried footsteps, a contrast to the elegant silence of the ballroom. Adrian Vance watched the scene with a calculating eye, knowing that this night would change everything. Adeline stood in the shadows, her heart beating fast as she realized that her life was now intertwined with this cold, powerful man. After Deef Scribe and the contract in the library near the fireplace stood a small mahogany tea table, where Higgins had left a silver tray with a steaming pot of Earl Grey tea and delicate porcelain cups. On Adrian's desk next to the tax reports lay several leather-bound military journals containing maps of the Peninsular Campaign, their edges frayed from years of use. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn shut to keep out the Yorkshire cold, casting a warm, intimate glow over the bookshelves. Adeline looked at the desk, remembering how her father's study in London used to be filled with the same smell of paper and ink, before everything was destroyed by fire and greed. The library of Stirling Manor was a vast ancient space, with dark oak bookshelves rising to the high ceiling, housing thousands of rare volumes and the confidential documents of the treasury. The pale winter sunlight filtered through large window panes foggy with condensation, casting solitary beams of light across the expensive Persian carpets. This was where Adrian spent most of his time working, far from the noise and hypocrisy of the London ton. The room was so quiet that the only sounds were the crackling of logs in the large fireplace and the wind whistling past the stone walls. The scent of old parchment and classic ink filled the air, creating a scholarly and solemn atmosphere. Adeline Vane, now working under the title of the Duke's private scribe, was quietly transcribing a pile of ancient Latin documents at the large oak desk in the corner. She maintained her calm facade, hearing nothing and speaking nothing, focusing entirely on her quill. Her handwriting was elegant, rounded, and perfectly precise, the hand of a well-born lady educated in the best London households, not that of a poor maid. She guided her pen carefully, striving to hide any tension from the man sitting opposite her. She knew that a single slip would instantly turn her new life into a dungeon. She sighed softly, moving her pen with practiced ease, trying to control her every breath. Adrian Vance sat behind his large desk, pretending to read the Royal Mint tax reports, but his gray eyes never left Adeline. He had observed her for 3 days. He realized this girl was not deaf. When a loud noise erupted in the corridor, she did not flinch, but when he turned a page containing confidential information about the counterfeit case, her fingers tightened on her pen. She was listening to every sound, every breath in this room. He smiled secretly in the shadows, appreciating the young woman's extraordinary patience. Adrian rose, walking silently behind Adeline. He placed a confidential document on her desk, which detailed the metallic ratios of gold and copper in the newly seized counterfeit sovereign coins. He spoke in a cold, level voice. The proportion of copper in these counterfeit sovereigns is 15%. Equivalent to 100,000 pounds of counterfeit copper coins circulated every month. Ordinary foundries cannot mix such an even alloy without leaving fractures on the surface. Unless they possess the formula of Alistair Vane. Hearing her father's name, Adeline's quill faltered for a fraction of a second. Though she quickly resumed writing as if nothing had happened, that tiny hesitation did not escape the Duke's sharp eyes. Adrian stepped around the desk to stand in front of her, using a long finger to lift her chin, forcing her to meet his razor-sharp gaze. "Enough, Adeline Vane," Adrian said, his voice dropping to an arctic calm that echoed through the quiet library. "You are not mute, and you are certainly not deaf. You are the daughter of Professor Vane, the sole heir of the Stirling Mint Charter that all of London is searching for." Adeline looked into Adrian's gray eyes. She knew she could no longer deceive this man. She slowly set down her quill, straightened her back, and lifted her head. The timid look of the deaf-mute maid vanished, replaced by the pride of a fallen noblewoman. She looked directly at him without flinching. "How long have you known your grace?" Adeline asked, her voice clear and natural after months of silence. Her voice carried no fear, only calm defiance. "Since you dropped the silver goblet at the ball." Adrian released her chin, taking a step back and folding his arms. A deaf maid could not smell metallic poison from 3 paces away, and a clumsy servant could not deflect a glass so precisely without scratching my skin. Furthermore, the anonymous notes detailing the counterfeit formula that appeared on my desk every morning. They were all written on the fine drawing paper from this library, in your noble Latin hand. Adeline offered a faint, dry smile, her hazel eyes flashing with intellect. "You are very sharp, sir. Yes, I am Adeline Vane. My cousin Lord Stirling Vane murdered my father to steal his minting formula. He is conspiring with corrupt officials at the Royal Mint to issue counterfeit money, ruining the national treasury. I feigned being deaf-mute only to survive and find a way to expose him." Adrian narrowed his eyes at her. He realized this girl was not only intelligent but incredibly brave. She possessed the Stirling Mint Charter, an exclusive charter controlling the royal gold reserves granted to her family by the king, valued at over 180,000 pounds. But this charter stated clearly, it would only take legal effect and be activated when Adeline married a nobleman holding the rank of duke or higher, a measure intended to prevent lower-class factions from seizing national assets. Lord Stirling Vane and his faction are preparing to accuse me of complicity in the counterfeiting to oust me from the treasury, Adrian said, his voice dropping dangerously. I need the formula and your expertise to assay the fake gold bars within the royal mint. And you need my protection from your cousin's assassins. You want a bargain? Adeline asked, locking her hazel eyes onto him. A marriage settlement, Adrian answered decisively. He stepped to the table and picked up a contract prepared by his solicitor, Mr. Grimshaw. I shall marry you and make you the Duchess of Stirling. My supreme power will be the strongest shield protecting you from the law and London society. In return, you must use your metallurgical knowledge to help me dismantle Lord Stirling Vane's counterfeit ring. When the case is resolved, I shall return your freedom and the Stirling Mint Charter. Adeline looked at the contract. She knew it was a dangerous gamble, but she had no other choice. To clear her father's name and punish her enemy, she needed Adrian's power. Just then Higgins knocked and escorted Mr. Grimshaw, the loyal solicitor of the Stirling family, into the room. Mr. Grimshaw carefully placed his worn leather case on the table, adjusted his spectacles, and reviewed every line of the marriage settlement to ensure that the supreme legal rights of the Stirling family were protected. The contract clearly outlined Adeline's management of the Yorkshire estate, and an annual pin money of £100 in exchange for her assaying the counterfeit gold. Adeline read through the legal terms slowly, demonstrating a deep understanding of aristocratic property law that left Mr. Grimshaw surprised and full of respect for her intellect. She picked up the quill and signed Adeline Vane beneath Adrian's name. Her signature was firm and resolute, reflecting her unyielding spirit. The arranged marriage between the coldest duke in England and his supposedly deaf scribe officially began, opening a new chapter filled with danger but also their only hope. The ink on the contract dried slowly, reflecting the dim candlelight in the quiet library. Adeline looked at her signature, knowing that she had bound her fate to the Duke of Stirling. She used a small brass magnifying glass to inspect the counterfeit coins once more, her mind already working on the chemical solutions she would need to prepare. Adrian watched her from across the room, his expression unreadable, but his mind filled with a strange, unfamiliar resolve to protect this mysterious girl at all costs. Chapter 3. The Silent Dinner and the Rules of the Stone Manor. Above the grand fireplace in the dining hall hung a massive oil painting of the first Duke of Stirling, a stern-looking man in Tudor armor whose dark eyes seemed to follow Adeline as she moved. The stone walls were lined with the shields and weapons of previous generations, reminders of the family's long history of service to the crown. The dining table itself was so large that the servants had to use long silver poles to light the candles in the center. Adeline felt the weight of these ancestors watching her, questioning her right to sit at the head of the table as the nominal duchess, yet she kept her back straight and refused to be intimidated by the ancient ghosts of the manor. Following the signing of the marriage settlement, Adeline officially moved into Stirling Manor as the nominal Duchess of Stirling. However, London society remained entirely unaware of this secret union. In the eyes of the servants and the head butler Higgins, Adele was still just the deaf-mute scribe kept by the Duke's side due to her expensive clumsiness. She faced suspicion and disdain from the older servants, who assumed she was using her beauty to entice his grace. Gossip in the kitchen occasionally reached her ears, but she kept a calm face, coldly ignoring it all. She understood that silence was her strongest shield to protect herself and prepare for the grand reversal. The first dinner took place in the manor's grand dining hall. The cavernous room, built of ancient gray stone, was cold and solemn. The black oak dining table stretched from one end of the room to the other. Adrian sat at the southern end, while Adeline sat at the northern end. The distance between them was so great that they could only see each other's faint outlines through the flickering candlelight of the large silver candelabras. The silence was intimidating. Only the wind howled outside the stone windows, and the soft clink of silver cutlery on porcelain echoed through the space. Servants stood formally against the walls, no one daring to make a sound. Adrian Vance observed Adeline from afar. Despite sitting in a cold, unfamiliar corner of the room, Adeline kept her back straight, her dining etiquette perfectly elegant and aristocratic. She showed no fear or awkwardness in the face of his stern presence or the silence of the room. This earned her Adrian's silent admiration. The young woman possessed remarkable poise. When the dinner concluded, Adrian signaled the servants to withdraw and closed the heavy dining room doors. He rose, walking along the long table to approach Adeline. His steps were steady, echoing in the empty hall. He stopped 3 paces from her, his voice low but carrying a warning. "Miss Vane," Adrian said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "There are rules in Stirling Manor you must follow absolutely. First, before guests and servants, you must continue to play the deaf-mute Adele. Any leak regarding your identity will bring Lord Stirling Vane to this estate, before we gather enough evidence. Adeline looked up at him, the candlelight reflecting in her eyes. I know the value of silence. Your Grace, I survived by it for 3 months. I shall not ruin your plans, second, Adrian continued, his voice dropping. My family entailment dictates that if I do not produce a legitimate heir, this entire estate will pass to my treacherous cousin. Our marriage is nominal, but the London season will scrutinize us closely. You will have to appear by my side for morning calls and upcoming balls to manage public opinion. Prepare yourself, Adeline bowed her head slightly. I shall perform my duties as a contract duchess. But I also have a condition. I require a small laboratory in the basement to prepare chemicals for the assay tests. My father's formula requires complex chemical reactions to extract the gold from the fakes without damaging the royal seal inside. I need basic metallurgical equipment. Adrian studied her for a long moment, evaluating the determination in her eyes. Finally, he nodded. Higgins will prepare what you need. But be careful with those chemicals. I do not want my manor burned down like your father's laboratory. Thank you for your concern, Your Grace, Adeline replied with a touch of Regency wit. I always know how to control my fire. Adrian turned and walked away, his tall figure disappearing behind the oak doors. Adeline remained alone in the silent dining hall, looking out the window at the howling blizzard. She knew the upcoming battle during the London season would involve not just poisons and counterfeit metals, but a psychological war with the cunning nobility. But she was ready. The ancient stone walls of Stirling Manor seemed to close in on Adeline as she walked back to her quarters, the cold drafts whispering secrets of the past. The scent of damp stone and old timber filled the corridors, a reminder of the estate's age and history. She knew that every servant was watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake, but she resolved to remain strong. Adrian stood in the doorway of his study, watching her departure with a quiet intensity, his thoughts occupied by the brave girl who now shared his name. Chapter 4: The Cavendish Ball and the Social Collision. Lady Cecilia's gown was of the finest pink tulle over white satin, adorned with delicate lace that had been imported from Brussels at great expense, yet her vanity could not hide her growing frustration. The dance floor was alive with the lively steps of the quadrille, followed by a romantic waltz that sent the couples spinning in a flurry of colorful silk and lace. The patronesses of Almack's sat on the raised platform at the end of the hall, their lorgnettes focused on Adeline's every movement, looking for any flaw in her posture or carriage. But Adeline moved with such effortless grace that even the most critical eyes could find no fault, leaving Lady Cecilia to chew her lip in silent anger. The London season officially commenced with a grand ball at the Marquess of Cavendish's mansion. This was the largest event of the year, bringing together the most powerful families in England. The ballroom sparkled with thousands of beeswax candles, and the polished wooden floor reflected the diamonds on the ladies' necks. Rumors that the cold Duke of Stirling had secretly betrothed himself to an unknown girl had spread through the noble salons, making them the center of all gossip. Carriage after carriage lined the avenue, and the reception hall overflowed with hypocritical social greetings. Matrons gathered around the tables, whispering and judging every new lady with severe looks. Adrian Vance entered the ballroom, his arm bent for Adeline to rest her slender fingers upon. Today Adeline no longer wore her drab gray servant's dress. She wore a tasteful emerald green silk gown, her brown hair pinned up simply but elegantly, revealing her graceful neck. However, as agreed, she kept a calm face and remained silent, playing the role of the Duke's mysterious deaf-mute wife. She felt hundreds of searching eyes and whispers of disdain directed at her the moment they crossed the ballroom threshold. She held her head high, refusing to let the rude whispers affect her noble poise. Their appearance immediately caused a stir. Feather fans opened to conceal whispering mouths. Look, that is the deaf-mute girl he brought back from the dinner that night, an elderly lady whispered to her daughter. What an insult to the Stirling name, a duke marrying a low-born mute. Lady Cecilia Cavendish stood among a group of noble ladies, her face twisted with envy and anger. She had spent years trying to win Adrian's attention only to fail, and now she saw him walking with a poor girl of unknown origin. Cecilia held a glass of wine and stepped forward, blocking their path with a mocking smile. Good evening, Duke Adrian. Cecilia curtsied politely, then turned to Adeline, her eyes scanning her simple dress with disdain. And good evening, our new Duchess Stirling. I heard His Grace married you out of pity. What a shame that such a grand ball cannot hear your voice to offer congratulations. Adeline stood tall beside Adrian. She looked directly into Cecilia's eyes, neither flinching nor showing hurt. Her silence was not cowardice but a proud dismissal that made Cecilia feel insulted. Cecilia narrowed her eyes and signaled a servant to bring a small notebook and a quill. If you cannot speak, surely you know how to write. Write your name on my cousin's dancing card. Or, does a low-born deaf-mute like you not even know how to write? Dimly the surrounding crowd began to chuckle, waiting for Adeline's public humiliation. Before Adeline could reach for the notebook, Adrian gently placed his gloved hand on her shoulder. He stepped forward, his tall figure completely shielding her from the crowd's stares. His gray eyes pinned Cecilia with an icy stare. "Lady Cecilia," Adrian said in a low, resonant voice that silenced the corner of the room. "My wife does not need to prove her education to anyone, especially to those who use their family honor to mask their own lack of breeding. Her education lies in the restraint and dignity she displays, a lesson I fear the Cavendish family has neglected to teach their daughter." Cecilia's face turned pale with humiliation. The chuckles vanished, replaced by the astonishment of the nobility at the Duke's public and fierce defense of his nameless wife. Adrian did not look at Cecilia for another second. He turned his head to Adeline, his gaze softening slightly. "Let us go, Adeline." The two walked proudly through the crowd, which parted to let them pass, leaving Cecilia standing alone in the ballroom in a state of absolute fury. Getting into the large carriage bearing the sterling falcon coat of arms, Adeline let out a soft sigh of relief, looking out the carriage window at the foggy winter night. Adrian sat opposite her, quiet but holding a warm private look for her. The next morning, a popular social column published a short, sensational piece about the event. The cold Duke of Stirling publicly defended his mysterious wife at the Cavendish ball, shattering the insults of high society. Is this a marriage of love, or is there a state secret behind it? This news shook the London ton, placing the Stirling family at the center of both respect and curiosity. Adeline tightened her hands slightly, an unfamiliar warmth rising in her chest. This man, though cold as ice, always protected her with sharp actions. The carriage ride back to Stirling Manor was long and silent, the wheels rattling over the cobblestones, and the dim gas lamps of London casting long shadows through the window. Adeline looked at the Duke, who sat in the shadows opposite her, his face half hidden by his dark cloak. She felt the tension between them, a silent understanding that they were now partners in a dangerous game. The gossip columns would write of them tomorrow, but she cared only for the justice she would soon bring to her father's memory. Chapter 5. Melting ice in the manor. The rain outside turned to heavy sleet, pounding like gravel against the bedroom windows and matching the storm that raged inside Adrian's feverish mind. Adeline carefully measured out 3 drops of valerian root and 2 drops of willow bark extract, mixing them into the warm broth she had prepared in the kitchen. She looked at the long, jagged scar on his ribs, imagining the chaos and terror of the Waterloo battlefield where he had received it. Her fingers were gentle as she applied the soothing herbal salve, her heart aching for the silent burden this man had carried for so long, without a single word of complaint. The Yorkshire blizzard returned to Stirling Manor, burying the grey stone walls of the old castle under a thick blanket of snow. Late at night, in the small basement laboratory, Adeline was carefully using glassware to distill chemicals for the assay tests on the counterfeit gold coins. The room smelled of faint sulfur and warm pine oil from the small fireplace. She focused intently, ignoring the cold. Her hands, though numb, remained precise as she measured each chemical drop. She breathed warmth into her small hands, telling herself to finish the tests quickly to provide Adrian with the most convincing evidence. Suddenly Higgins knocked and entered in a panic. "My lady." The Duke, his old Waterloo wound has flared up due to the freezing cold. He has a high fever and is delirious in his study, but he refuses to call the royal physician for fear of exposing the case. Adeline immediately set down her test tube, gathered the fever-reducing herbs and antiseptic oils her father had prepared, and hurried upstairs. Inside Adrian's master bedroom, the Duke lay on the large oak bed, his face pale, sweat on his brow, his lips tight with pain. The high fever made him delirious, his large hands gripping the wool blanket. He repeatedly called out the name of his late brother who had died in battle years ago, his voice filled with grief and despair. Adeline approached the bed, placing her hand gently on his forehead. The heat from his body startled her. She turned to Higgins. "Bring warm water and clean cloths. Then wait outside and do not let anyone enter." Throughout the night, Adeline sat patiently by Adrian's bed. She bathed his body with warm water, carefully applying herbal oil to the long scar on his left side, a grim reminder of Waterloo. She gently poured the fever-reducing medicine into his mouth, coaxing him to drink it drop by drop. She stroked his hair, trying to soothe the mental and physical pain tormenting him. In his delirium, Adrian gripped Adeline's hand. His grip was tight, as if holding onto a lifeline in a storm. "Do not go," Adrian mumbled hoarsely, his voice reflecting the solitude of a man carrying the weight of the nation alone. "Why must everyone betray me?" Adeline did not pull her hand away. She used her free hand to stroke his hair, comforting him with a gentle voice. "I am here, Adrian. No one shall betray you tonight. Rest easy." Toward dawn, Adrian's fever finally broke. His breathing became steady and peaceful, exhausted. Adeline rested her head against the bedside and fell into a deep sleep, her hand still held tightly by Adrian. As the first morning light filtered through the curtains, Adrian opened his eyes. The fever was gone and his mind was clear. He looked down and saw Adeline asleep by his bed. The early light highlighted her tired but peaceful face. Adrian looked down at their joined hands. He noticed the small, pale gray scars on Adeline's slender fingers left by the assay acids, proof of her tireless work to help him. A warm current flowed through the cold Duke's heart, melting the thick ice. He gently released her hand, draping the wool blanket over her shoulders to shield her from the morning chill. He promised himself that no matter how this counterfeit case ended, he would use his life and power to protect this resilient girl. The snow piled high on the windowsill, muffling the sounds of the outside world and creating a peaceful sanctuary in the Duke's bedchamber. The grand-grandfather clock in the hall chimed the late hours, its steady tick-tock a comforting rhythm in the quiet house. Adeline watched Adrian's breathing, her hand resting near his, feeling a strange sense of peace in the midst of the storm. She knew the battle was far from over, but in this quiet room she felt a bond forming that no scandal could break. Chapter 6. The Tea Table of Suspicion and the Wurmkel Cracks. She remembered the quiet afternoons she had spent in her father's laboratory in London, where the sun would filter through the dusty windows and illuminate the rows of colorful chemical bottles. Her father would patiently explain the properties of metals, his voice warm and encouraging as he guided her small hands through the experiments. She had felt so safe then, wrapped in the love of her family and the quiet pursuit of science. Now, standing in the cold basement of Stirling Manor, she felt a profound sense of loss, realizing that the trust she had begun to place in Adrian might have been built on a foundation of political convenience and lies. The relationship between Adrian Vance and Adeline Vane made warm, quiet progress after that night of the Yorkshire winter storm. They began a habit of taking afternoon tea together in the large glass conservatory, which was bathed in the pale, transient winter sunlight of northern England. Surrounded by lush green ivy and winter roses, blooming proudly against the frost, they analyzed the progress of the counterfeit case together, through handwritten notes and schematic drawings. Adrian no longer sat at the far cold end of the long dining table during dinner. He had moved his chair to sit beside her, quietly and thoughtfully serving her food and pouring tea for her before the astonished but highly respectful eyes of Higgins and the manor servants. His silent care breathed a gentle healing warmth into Adeline's scarred and weary soul, making her believe that she had finally found a safe and secure harbor after her long, terrifying wanderings. A sense of mutual trust was slowly forming, bringing her great comfort. However, this newly blossomed peace and trust were suddenly shattered by an unexpected shock. That afternoon, Adeline brought the translated files of the ancient Latin documents of the Senate to Adrian's study. The study was empty. Adrian had gone down to the royal gold vault with Higgins to inventory the sovereigns seized from the smuggling raid the previous night. On the massive mahogany desk, a confidential report bearing the red wax seal of the Senate lay open. Adeline placed her translation folder on the desk. Her eyes accidentally drifted over Adrian's sharp, black-inked handwriting on the official report to the Royal Council. Primary suspect supplying the wear-resistant alloy formula to Lord Stirling Vane's counterfeit smuggling ring, Professor Alistair Vane. Evidence at the scene of the laboratory fire indicates that Alistair Vane may have received a massive bribe of £100,000 before personally burning down the foundry to erase all traces. Adeline felt as though the earth were crumbling beneath her feet. Her head spun, her entire body trembling violently. The folder fell from her hands, pages scattering across the Persian rug. She could not believe that the man she had begun to trust, the man who had promised to protect her, was the one who wrote these cruel words. Her father, an honest scholar who had spent his life serving the crown, and had sacrificed his life to protect the Vane assay formula, was concluded by Adrian Vance to be the prime suspect in the counterfeiting ring. So it was all just a heartless exploitation, Adeline whispered, choked on her words, tears welling in her eyes, though she firmly bit her lip to keep them from falling. She realized that Adrian Vance had married her and brought her here as a nominal duchess only to obtain her father's metallurgical formula as evidence to close the case, securing his position as Chancellor of the Exchequer before the pressure of the nobility. He had never truly trusted her father or her. All his previous gestures of tenderness and protection were merely a facade to conceal his true motive. She felt a sharp pang in her chest, as if all her newly lit hopes had been brutally extinguished in the winter night. She felt betrayed by the very man she had just begun to trust. At that moment, Adrian entered the study. Seeing Adeline frozen before the desk with a pale face and the open report, he understood everything instantly. "Adeline, let me explain." Adrian stepped forward quickly, reaching to place a hand on her shoulder. That report was only an initial draft based on documents gathered from the Royal Mint, meant as a decoy to lure the enemy. Adeline immediately backed away 2 steps, dodging his touch as if avoiding a poison. Her eyes locked on him, cold, distant, and filled with utter disappointment. The warmth between them over the past days shattered into 100 pieces. She spoke not a word. She bent down to gather her papers quickly, slammed the folder onto his desk, and turned to walk straight out of the study, slamming the heavy oak door behind her. From that day, Adeline returned to a state of absolute, unyielding silence. She packed her belongings from the master bedchamber and moved to a small guest room in the east wing of Stirling Manor. She refused to dine with Adrian, locking herself in the basement laboratory to prepare chemicals. Her analytical reports were sent to his desk only through cold, brief handwritten notes. Completed assay for sample number 5. Copper core with gold plating accounts for 20%. No trace of other chemicals, all metrics recorded in the confidential file. Adrian Vance stood alone in his study, looking at the cold handwriting. He knew the crack between them was now too deep, and unless he captured Lord Stirling Vane to prove her father's innocence, he would lose the girl forever. On her desk in the guest room, Adeline opened her father's old laboratory journal, looking at the hand-drawn sketches of the Royal Mint furnaces and the notes on gold purity. Every page was a reminder of the life they had lost, and the regret she felt was a heavy burden on her heart. She looked at the cold notes she had written for Adrian, wondering if she had been too quick to judge him. But the pain of betrayal was still fresh, and she resolved to focus on her work until the truth was finally revealed. Chapter 7. The Villain's Trap and a Dangerous Confrontation. Lord Stirling's carriage was a heavy, ostentatious vehicle painted in black and gold, its panels bearing a newly designed coat of arms that lacked the history of the ancient families. His henchmen were rough-looking men from the London docks, their faces scarred from street fights, and their hands resting heavily on the hilts of their pistols. The maids of Stirling Manor huddled in the corners of the kitchen, whispering in fear as the soldiers marched through the corridors. Adeline stood her ground in the conservatory, her heart beating fast but her face remaining a mask of cold indifference as her cousin approached with his cruel threats. Adeline's silence was like a sharp blade embedded in Adrian's heart every day. However, time waited for no one. Across London, Lord Stirling Vane had begun to suspect the true identity of the deaf-mute maid Adel at Stirling Manor. He knew Adrian Vance was close to exposing his ring, and he needed the Vane assay formula to complete the largest batch of counterfeit gold coins in history to fund his political allies. He kept a close watch on the Stirling estate, hiring professional spies to linger around Stirling Manor looking for a weakness. All activities at the estate were temporarily paralyzed by the aggressive presence of the guards. Adeline was in the glass conservatory, tending to the plants when they cornered her. Lord Stirling Vane stepped forward, his face cunning and cruel. He looked at her with the hateful eyes of the man who had stolen her family's happiness. "Ah, my dear deaf-mute niece," Lord Stirling Vane sneered, his eyes like a serpent staring at her. "You play the part well, but I know you are Adeline Vane. Your father is dead, and you hold the Stirling Mint Charter and the formula. Hand over that logbook, and I shall spare your life. Otherwise, I shall denounce Duke Adrian Vance to the king for harboring a fugitive and a counterfeiting accomplice." Lady Cecilia stood beside him, mocking triumphantly. Indeed, a low-born deaf-mute attempting to climb the social ladder as the Duchess of Stirling? The arrival of the guards today will mark the end of your delusions. Know your place before it is too late. Adeline stood motionless, her hands tightening on the hem of her light blue dress. She kept her face expressionless, saying nothing, playing the pathetic deaf-mute. But inside, fear and fury warred. She despised the man who had murdered her father, and now stood threatening to destroy everything. She told herself to maintain her dignity, not letting him see any hesitation. She knew that if she surrendered now, her father's name would never be cleared. As Lord Stirling Vane's guards prepared to search her basement laboratory, the thunder of hooves echoed outside. Adrian Vance alighted from his carriage, his face dark with fury. He strode into the grand hall with the absolute authority of a duke. Lord Sterling, Adrian's voice dropped to an arctic calm, causing the guards to halt immediately. Who gave you permission to bring armed men into a duke's estate? Without a signed warrant from the Senate, I have the right to hang you all on the spot for unlawful entry. Do not test my patience. Lord Sterling Vane smiled coldly, stepping back. Duke Adrian, I am merely searching for a fugitive counterfeiter. But mark my words, at the royal hearing in 3 days before the king and the Senate, all evidence of your complicity with the Vane family in issuing counterfeit money will be presented. When that happens, you will find it difficult to keep your title, let alone your life. Lord Sterling Vane signaled his men to withdraw. Lady Cecilia Cavendish followed in frustration. Adrian watched them disappear into the cold fog, his eyes flashing with determination. The final battle had arrived. Lord Sterling's gold ring glinted in the winter sun as he gestured to his guards, his greedy hands eager to seize the Vane family fortune. His sneer was a mask for his desperation, for he knew that the Duke was closing in on his illegal operations. The tension in the courtyard was thick, the guards standing ready for a fight at the slightest provocation. But Adrian's arrival had shattered their confidence, leaving them to retreat in silence, knowing that the final confrontation would take place before the highest court of the land. Chapter 8. The Truth Revealed, and the Mint Charter. Alistair Vane's letter also contained a detailed pedigree of the Vane family, tracing their lineage back to the reign of Queen Elizabeth, and proving their historical right to the Sterling Mint Charter. The document finds by the king's own hand, its heavy wax seal representing the ultimate authority over the royal treasury. Adeline ran her fingers over the signature of her father, feeling a deep connection to the man who had sacrificed everything to ensure her safety. She understood now that Adrian had been carrying this secret letter for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment to strike down their common enemy and restore her family's honor. That very evening, Adrian Vance entered the library, where Adeline was quietly putting away books. He closed the heavy doors and locked them. Adeline maintained her cold demeanor, attempting to step past him, but Adrian blocked her path before the grand bookshelf. We must speak, Adeline, not through cold papers but with your true voice, Adrian said, his tone warm but firm and pleading. Adeline raised her eyes to him, her gaze dripping with sarcasm. What is there to say? Your Grace? Shall we discuss how you will submit your report accusing my father of treason, to save your title at the upcoming hearing? Adrian sighed softly, reaching into his inner coat pocket to withdraw a yellowed aged letter, placing it into her trembling hands. Read this before you condemn me, Adrian said quietly. Confused, Adeline opened the letter. It was the familiar handwriting of her father, Professor Alistair Vane, sent to Adrian Vance a week before the fire. Your Grace, I write to warn you of a massive counterfeiting plot orchestrated by my cousin, Lord Sterling Vane. He has taken me hostage and threatened the life of my daughter Adeline to force me to yield the alloy formula. I have purposely created a false logbook to mislead him, claiming complicity to buy time to protect Adeline. If anything should happen to me, please marry Adeline to activate the Sterling Mint Charter. Only your rank can shield her from his cruelty. Adeline read her father's words, and the tears she had held back finally fell, staining the old paper. She realized she had completely misjudged Adrian. The confidential report on his desk was actually her father's original warning, and Adrian had included her father's name in the suspect list to bait Lord Sterling Vane into exposing his entire ring, not to frame her father. She sank to her knees on the oak floor, sobbing with regret and belated gratitude. She had been too unjust to doubt his steadfast protection. Adrian, Adeline sobbed, looking up at him with deep remorse. I am sorry, I thought you were only using me. Adrian stepped forward, gently gathering her into his arms. He rested his chin on her brown hair, soothing her. I promise to protect you with my life. Adeline, your father was a hero who sacrificed himself for the realm. I would never allow his name to be tarnished. Your suspicion was natural given the circumstances. Do not blame yourself, we must stand together. Adeline felt the warmth and sincerity of his steady heartbeat. Her doubts evaporated, replaced by a love deeper and stronger than before. She rested her head against his chest, a sense of peace wrapping around her weary soul. She knew she was no longer alone on this perilous path to justice. She gripped his sleeve, thanking fate for bringing her such a reliable man. What must we do at the hearing? Adeline asked, her eyes shining with resolve. Lord Sterling Vane will present counterfeit gold bars stamped with the Sterling seal to implicate me, Adrian explained. We must prove those bars are fake directly before the king. Adeline smiled confidently. I have perfected the assay acid in the laboratory. I shall use a special nitric acid solution to strip the gold plating, exposing the copper core directly in court. This chemical reaction will produce a characteristic blue foam that no illegal mint can hide. I shall expose his plots on myself. The parchment of the Sterling Mint Charter was thick and yellowed, its heavy royal wax seal representing the ultimate authority over the gold reserves of the empire. Adeline ran her hand over the signatures of the king and her father, feeling the weight of her inheritance and the responsibility that came with it. Adrian stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder, his presence a steady anchor in her sea of emotions. They were ready for the hearing, united in their quest for justice and honor. Chapter 9. The tension and triumph in the hearing hall. The House of Lords was a grand, Gothic chamber filled with rows of red leather benches, where the peers of the realm sat in their ceremonial robes. The walls were adorned with rich wood carvings, and stained glass windows depicting the history of the monarchy, casting colorful light over the assembly. In the center of the room sat the Chancellor's woolsack, where Adrian took his seat with an air of quiet power. The gallery above was packed with spectators and reporters, their pens ready to record every word of the dramatic trial that would decide the fate of the nation's financial system. The hearing took place in the Grand Hall of the House of Lords, presided over by King George IV and the highest peers of the realm. The atmosphere was stiflingly tense. The press and the public focused all attention on this clash. The nobility packed the gallery, whispering about the potential fall of the powerful Sterling house. The rumor that the Duke of Sterling had stolen royal gold enraged the senators. Lord Sterling Vane stood at the witness stand, his face smug and his eyes glinting with a malicious triumph that he did not care to hide. He pointed to the large gold bars on the table, which gleamed dully under the dim morning light, filtering through the stained glass windows. Your Majesty, these gold bars were recovered directly from the vaults of the Treasury, under the sole management and supervision of Duke Adrian Vance. They are counterfeit, gold-plated copper. Adrian Vance has systematically stolen the crown's gold reserves and replaced them with cheap metal for wartime profit. I have brought forward several ledger books and witnesses from the mint who will testify to the Duke's illicit transactions and his secret meetings with shady merchants. Lady Cecilia Cavendish and her father, the Marquess of Cavendish, nodded in agreement, whispering to the surrounding peers to stir up a storm of protest and demand Adrian's immediate ousting from the Treasury. Angry murmurs filled the hall as several lords began to voice their outrage, calling for a full investigation and the immediate suspension of the Duke's ministerial powers. Duke Adrian Vance, what say you in your defense? The king asked sternly, his voice echoing off the high stone vaults of the chamber. Adrian Vance rose from his seat, his calm confidence rendering the room completely silent. Your Majesty, I need no defense. I have acted solely to protect the national treasury from a treasonous plot. I wish to call a special witness who will prove who actually minted the counterfeit gold and who has been pulling the strings from the shadows. The heavy oak doors of the hall opened with a slow, dramatic creak. Adeline Vane entered the chamber, walking with a slow, measured grace that commanded the attention of everyone present. She wore a magnificent duchess gown of royal blue silk, adorned with delicate lace around the collar, and a small diamond tiara sparkled on her pinned-up brown hair. Her posture was regal and elegant, and as her hazel eyes met Adrian's, a silent understanding passed between them. The whispering in the gallery rose to a confused hum as several elderly lords leaned forward, recognizing the delicate features of the Vane family. Lord Sterling Vane gasped, his face turning a sickly shade of white as he pointed a trembling finger at her, shouting, Your Majesty, this is highly irregular. That is only Adele, a clumsy deaf-mute servant from the Sterling estate. She has no standing to witness before this house, nor does she possess the capacity to understand these proceedings. Amidst the silent hall, Adeline stepped to the stand. She stood straight, raised her head, and spoke in a clear, resonant voice like a silver bell. Your Majesty, I am not mute, and I am certainly not deaf. I am Adeline Vane, the only daughter of Professor Alistair Vane, and the rightful heir of the Sterling Mint Charter. The chamber erupted in shock. Lord Sterling Vane went pale, stumbling back. Adeline did not give him time to react. She took 2 vials of special acid from a wooden case. She poured the nitric acid over the gold bars Lord Sterling Vane had presented. Instantly, a violent chemical reaction occurred. The thin gold plating was corroded, bubbling into a bright green-blue foam and releasing a sulphurous scent, exposing the dark copper core underneath. Behold, Your Majesty, Adeline pointed to the reaction. This is my father's exclusive assay method. Real gold never reacts to nitric acid. Only gold-plated copper produces this blue foam. And if one looks closely at the corroded copper core, she lifted the bar with tongs, pointing to the hidden engraving inside. It bears the mark of the Sterling Vane foundry, owned by Lord Stirling Vane. He is the mastermind. The undeniable evidence lay before them. The chamber erupted in astonishment and royal fury. Lord Stirling Vane, desperate and wild, drew a small dagger hidden in his sleeve and lunged at Adeline. "You wretched girl, you have ruined everything." But Adrian Vance was faster. He stepped in front of Adeline, catching the man's wrist and disarming him with sheer strength, throwing Lord Stirling Vane to the cold floor. Royal guards instantly subdued him. Amidst the chaos, Adrian held Adeline close, his gray eyes sweeping over the conspirators, his voice resonant as he delivered his protective vow. "She needs to prove her standing to no one, for from this day forth, her standing is me." King George IV rose, slamming his scepter. "Lord Stirling Vane, you are guilty of high treason and counterfeiting. All your estates are confiscated, and you are banished to the southern colonies for life. Marquis Cavendish and Lady Cecilia, for your complicity in this slander, you are barred from the London season henceforth." The whispering in the gallery rose to a dull roar as the guards led Lord Stirling Vane away, his screams of rage and curses echoing through the stone arches of the House of Lords. The peers of the realm watched in stunned silence, their faces reflecting the absolute shock of the dramatic revelation that had unfolded before their very eyes. Adrian Vance stood tall and proud, his eyes meeting the king's, receiving a quiet nod of royal approval that sealed his political and personal victory. Adeline looked at the Duke, her heart filled with an overwhelming sense of gratitude, and a growing love for the man who had stood by her through it all, risking his own title and reputation to protect her and honor her father's memory. She felt the heavy burden of the past 3 months lift from her shoulders, replaced by a deep feeling of peace and safety. Chapter 10. The Duchess of Stirling, and the Perfect Triumph. The counterfeit scandal concluded with a resounding victory for Duke Adrian Vance and his brilliant wife. Lord Stirling Vane was exiled to the far colonies, his massive fortune confiscated, and the Stirling Vane foundry demolished. He was left a broken man, destined to spend his remaining days in squalor. Lady Cecilia Cavendish was shunned by the London ton. No one dared send calling cards or invite her to gatherings. The patronesses of Almack's flatly denied her vouchers, destroying her reputation and permanently banishing her from high society. Marquis Cavendish retreated to his country estate in disgrace. Professor Alistair Vane's honor was fully restored, posthumously named a hero of the royal treasury by the king, his name carved upon the stone gates of the Royal Mint. Adeline Vane officially inherited the Stirling Mint Charter, becoming the first woman to hold exclusive control over the largest gold reserves in Great Britain. She was invited as a lifetime honorary member of the Royal Society of London, an unprecedented honor for a woman, in recognition of the Vane Assay formula. No longer the poor deaf-mute servant Adele, she was now the most respected and elegant Duchess of Stirling of the London season. Her intellect, dignity, and beauty were celebrated by the ton. Those who had mocked her now lined up to catch her eye or send calling cards. That night, a magnificent ball was held at Stirling Manor to celebrate the Treasury's recovery. The ancient stone hall was no longer cold, the large fireplace brightly, filling the room with warmth. As Adrian and Adeline descended the stone staircase, the London nobility, who had once sneered at her, fell silent and bowed low to welcome the Duchess of Stirling. Admiration shone on every aristocratic face. Adrian turned to Adeline, a rare, warm smile gracing his face. He offered his hand. "May I have the honor of the first dance, my Duchess?" Adeline smiled radiantly, placing her hand in his. "Most gladly, Your Grace." They stepped onto the floor amidst applause. Under the crystal chandeliers, their love, tested by fire and acid, shone brighter than gold. The orchestra in the balcony played a beautiful sweeping waltz, the violins and oboes filling the grand hall with a melody that seemed to lift the spirits of everyone present. The ladies' dresses were a sea of pastel silks, soft lavender, pale rose, and delicate blue, spinning in perfect harmony under the brilliant chandeliers. The guests who had once looked down on Adeline now watched with sincere respect, their faces filled with admiration for the new Duchess. Adrian held her close, his hand warm against her back as they spun across the floor, their eyes locked in a silent promise of a shared future that would be brighter than the stars above. This triumph was not just a punishment for the wicked, but the ultimate societal acknowledgement of their love and resilience. They had proved that truth and sincerity always conquer darkness. From this day forward, Stirling Manor would be filled with light, laughter, and the everlasting love of Adrian and Adeline. The path ahead was bright, warming the hearts of two souls who had braved the storm to find each other. She rested her head against his shoulder as they moved to the waltz, thinking that this was the true marriage settlement her father had always wished for her. Comforted by his warm embrace, she closed her eyes and let the beautiful music carry them into their new life together.